Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. If you're looking for an all-in-one platform that allows you to showcase your work and run an online business, you can do all of that with Squarespace. Hello friends! In today's video, I am going to be showing you the process of me creating an illustration almost entirely from colored pencils. I will be using both the Premiere Prismacolor colored pencils as well as the Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. All the supplies used will be listed in the description down below as always. Before we get into the process, I just quickly wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. As an artist and small business owner, it's really important to be able to showcase my work in a professional and efficient manner. Contrary to what you'd expect from someone who graduated from graphic design, I actually am not very knowledgeable when it comes to coding, so creating a website normally would be a very daunting task for me. However, with Squarespace, it has an incredibly intuitive website builder that has beautiful ready-made templates that are totally customizable. Some of the features I really love is that you can edit your images directly on the platform, and it has already designed to be fully responsive to other devices, which is really important since a lot of people use mobile to browse websites. My website is still currently a work in progress, but I'm really looking forward to having my own domain that can function as both a professional portfolio as well as a storefront. So if you are looking to upgrade your online presence, check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. For those of you who have seen the majority of my videos, you might already know that colored pencils used to be my main medium back in my high school days. It was the medium that felt the most accessible and approachable for me, and of course, since then I have tried and loved many other mediums, and I often will use colored pencils in conjunction with other media, such as markers and gouache, but admittedly it had been quite a while since I had done any illustrations solely using colored pencils, so I thought that it'd be a fun thing to tackle for old time's sake. So like the majority of my pieces, I first start out with sketching the piece with an erasable colored pencil, and then once I'm satisfied with the sketch, I then move on to coloring the skin. I start out by covering the entire face with a very light peach, then using a slightly more saturated peach pencil, I start coloring the face, but avoiding all the areas that I want to have the brightest highlights, such as the bridge and tip of the nose, the brow bones, the high points of her cheeks, and above her lip. And then from there, I'm using an even warmer colored pencil to, like you may have guessed, give a little bit more warmth to her face. So you can see with this pencil, I am concentrating kind of around her cheeks, her nose, a little bit of her chin, and then you'll also see me use this same colored pencil to add a wash of color to her lips as well. Then from there, I also go ahead using the same vermilion color. I color in some of the areas that I want to be in shadow as well, such as under the lip, nose, and around her eyes. The important thing to note about the way I like to approach using colored pencils is that you want to use a very light hand and very slowly build up the colors and the values. This is pretty much the same with the way that I approach pretty much any kind of process, whether it be watercolors, gouache, colored pencils. I find that I like to just work in very many thin layers to work up to saturation and value. And then now we're using a very light purple pencil to start filling in the shadows. I personally like to use a purple or cool color for the darker shadow areas on a portrait rather than like a brown, because I find visually it looks more interesting, and I also find that a cool color for the shadows creates a nice contrast against the very warm skin tones that I normally go for as well. Another important piece of advice I would have for using colored pencils is that you want to keep your pencils sharp. Not only does that allow for more precision, but I also find that it also results in a much more even coverage when you're coloring an area. And something that you'll quickly notice about how I approach the illustration is that I jump around from element to element. The reason for that is because The values and saturation will look completely different when it's surrounded by the blank paper versus other elements that are also being colored. So rather than trying to render one thing from start to finish, I prefer to slowly chip away at the entire piece bit by bit. And so similarly how I did with the face, I start out by covering the entire area with one solid shade of color, this time using a red, of course, for the flower petals and then a green for the leaves. And again, using very light pressure. You'll actually see me use a kneadable eraser to pick up some of the pigment as well, which is another benefit from using light pressure if you've made a mistake or want to lighten up an area. And in this case, I had accidentally started coloring one of the leaves with the red instead of a green, and so I used the kneadable eraser to kind of pick up some of the red. It's not perfect, but it definitely does help. And particularly in these earlier layers, I prefer to use the Prismacolor pencils, and the reason for that is because the lead is quite soft, which results in a really good color payoff, and I find that they blend quite nicely as well because that they're softer. The downside though is that they do break a little easier because the lead is soft, so that is definitely something to keep in mind if you find that you're pretty heavy-handed. To be honest, when I started this piece, I actually didn't really have a clear plan in mind with the color palette. All I knew was that I wanted to do a close-up portrait of someone who was surrounded by poinsettias. I didn't really like the initial green shade that I used for the leaves, so you'll see me use a blue on top of it to try and make it lean a little bit more teal. This is the great thing about slowly building up the colors, is being able to, in a way, color mix with how you choose to layer up your colors. The next piece of advice I want to give about working with colored pencils is the type of paper you use. Generally, dry media like pencils, pastels, charcoal, etc. are pretty versatile when it comes to types of paper that you can use, since you don't have to worry about any kind of water absorption. However, depending on how you like to work, there are a few things to keep in mind. For me, as we've learned, I like to build up an illustration with many layers, and for my style of work, I also prefer to render things fairly smoothly and precisely. Colored pencils are generally better on paper that has a little bit of texture or tooth to it. The reason for that is that the pencil pigments need something to grip onto, and if the paper surface is too smooth, you won't be able to achieve many layers on it. This is another reason why I stress needing to use light pressure, especially in those early stages of the process, because if you press too hard too soon, you'll actually crush the fibers of the paper, which will not allow for more layers of color after the fact. However, because of my preferred style of drawing, I don't want to have too much texture, since I generally do a lot of portraits and I like to have a lot of details. And so I chose this sketchbook since the paper in it has a very light textured surface, which is enough for the colored pencils to grip onto, but it also allows me to get fairly clean line work as well. So now you can see we're starting to reach a stage in the process where I'm using a little bit more pressure now, and the colors are slowly starting to look a little bit more saturated. As I mentioned before, I was still being pretty indecisive with my color choices, so you'll see me using teals over the leaves, and then to try and make the poinsettias behind her head look like they're kind of receding into the background a little more, I give them an entire wash of a purple color pencil to not only darken them, but as well as desaturate the colors as well. Then from here on out, I basically just continue to layer up the colors to strengthen the color and values in the piece, and with each passing layer, I begin using more and more pressure. Another thing to note about using colored pencils is that I think it really helps bring a piece to life if you use a variation of hues within each element. Of course, earlier I already talked about this with the skin tone, like how I was using the purples for the shadows and then using much warmer tones for the mid and lighter range. But in a more subtle way, I also do this with the poinsettias in this piece as well. So of course, you don't need to use an entire rainbow of colors, but as an example, the poinsettias, I ended up using a magenta for the center of the petals and then a more classic red for the outer edges of the petals. This color variation, while pretty subtle, I think helps make the piece look a little bit more interesting than just using one hue for an element. So the reason I chose to create a portrait with poinsettias was because for my limited edition art print over on my Patreon page, I had asked my patrons what kind of theme they wanted for the month of December. The theme of winter ended up being the winter, which is actually a theme I don't illustrate too often, which is kind of ironic since I've grown up and lived in Canada all of my life. Of course, when you think of winter, the first thing that comes to my mind is snow. However, instead of going in that route, I decided to go with poinsettias since they are so common around this time of year, and it also gives me a little bit of a holiday vibe as well. Keeping in mind though, I didn't want to create a piece that was overtly holiday or Christmas themed either, since I wanted the piece to be able to suit someone's wall or decor all year round. I think this was probably why I kept trying to avoid that classic red and green color palette by making the leaves lean a little bit more teal and then adding a little bit more magenta into the poinsettia petals. For the first half of this drawing process, I actually had no idea what color I wanted her hair to be. I figured I would settle on something as the piece progressed, and eventually I ended up deciding I really liked the contrast of the bright white hair against the very saturated poinsettias. Plus, it ultimately made the piece feel much more wintry as well, since, like I said, winter often equates to snow, and having kind of this bright white hair kind of resembles snow. And yeah, I felt like it also helped the color palette not feel like it was competing with too many elements by just having a very neutral, large area on the piece. Something that you'll see me doing here, and I've done this in previous illustrations as well, is that I'm using a piece of paper underneath my hand. And the reason for that is because I don't want my hand to be smudging the color pencil around, since the way that I like to work is I like to rest my hand on the surface. And so I'm just using one of my old business cards here, and then I'm making a nod to the fact that my nail polish matched that colored pencil perfectly. But yeah, so that's a big kind of tip as well. I've seen people wear gloves, like a cotton glove, while they work with colored pencils, not like to prevent themselves from smudging the paper, but I prefer to just use a little scrap piece of paper or some kind of old business card to prevent my hand from smudging the drawing. And now we've basically reached a point where I don't really have much else to say about the process of this piece specifically, since it's pretty much just rinse and repeat for the duration of this footage. I made a story on my Instagram page while I was working on this, joking about how I think the reason why I don't do full colored pencil illustrations anymore was because it's so tedious and time consuming. The way that I work for most mediums is often tedious and time consuming, but it just felt extra grueling when it came to colored pencils, and my hand was honestly cramping up by the end of this piece. I think the reason why I often opt to use gouache or markers with colored pencils is because it's a much quicker way to get a large area of color down first with the gouache or the marker, and then just add the pencils on top to create those color variations and shading. Of course, using only colored pencil does have a very different appearance overall in comparison to those mixed media methods, and I'm still really glad I did this piece. There's something kind of dreamy and soft and delicate about this look in this style. And by the way, if you are interested in seeing my process of using gouache and colored pencils together, or markers and colored pencils, I have dedicated videos to both of those methods on my channel. Alcohol markers and colored pencils has actually been a method I've been particularly enjoying for my live streams that I've done both on Instagram and I recently had done on my YouTube channel. During that YouTube live stream, someone had asked me that since I dedicated all of October to Halloween illustrations, if I would be doing the same this month for Christmas / the holiday season. This illustration that you've been watching me create is probably the closest thing you'll see from me in relation to the holidays or Christmas. Not that I don't like Christmas movies, there's actually a number of them that I do enjoy, but the general aesthetic and vibe of Halloween is just way more up my alley than the holidays are. When Halloween rolls around, I get freaking hyped. Whereas when the holiday season rolls around, I kind of become the Grinch, low-key. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that I had worked retail for many, many years, and if you've worked retail during the holiday season, you'll probably understand where I'm coming from. Working customer service is soul-crushing enough, but it's especially worse during this time of the year, in my opinion. A lot of workplaces will begin playing Christmas music right on November 1st, and so you're subjected to listening to the same 10 Christmas songs in every version imaginable, day in and day out. Plus, for most businesses, this is the busiest and most profitable time of the year, so of course, all of the employees are being worked harder than ever, and the customers are all stressed and irritable trying to get all of their holiday shopping and tasks done. Overall, it just gave me such a feeling of dread and stress. Now, you're probably wondering, but wait, Tina, don't you cherish the fact that the holiday season means you get to spend quality time with your family? My answer is no, not really, because when I was working retail, I was required to work either Christmas Eve or Boxing Day, which meant I was only able to go back to my mom's place and relax to see my family for 2 days. Of course, there's nothing wrong with liking the holiday season. If you're someone who really loves this time of the year, then I am super happy for you. But for those of you who have to work retail, customer service, or for whatever reason just don't necessarily love this time of the year, I am totally with you on that, and I stand with you in solidarity. That being said, there are a number of Christmas movies that I do enjoy to watch during this season, such as The Nightmare Before Christmas, which of course is both a Halloween and Christmas movie. Home Alone, of course, is an absolute classic. I also really enjoy Elf, and the newest addition being the beautifully animated Klaus, which, funnily enough, I watched for the first time back in June or July. But I gotta say, I think my top favorite Christmas movie has got to be Die Hard, which, yes, in my eyes, it technically is a Christmas movie. And feel free to let me know what your favorite Christmas or holiday movies are. I would love to add it to my list, and maybe it will help change my mind about Christmas time. Or alternatively, if you're a Grinch like me, feel free to let me know your retail or customer service horror stories, and we can complain about them together. Anyways, I hope that you enjoy listening to my random rambles, or at least got some useful tips from hearing about my colored pencil illustration process. Like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be the artwork for my limited edition Patreon print, so if you're interested in receiving this gal, you can pledge to my $10 or higher tiers on Patreon anytime between now and December 1st, and you'll receive a print of this portrait sent to your home. If you're not in the market for a print, in my $5 tier on Patreon, you will have access to the exclusive video that I made talking through how I did the sketching portion of this piece, and I specifically go into detail about how I go about constructing a portrait. Lastly, while I did mainly use colored pencils for this piece, I did end up using a little bit of gold ink for the earrings and my favorite white Posca marker for the little highlights on her face, like the eyes and the nose and the tops of the cheekbones. And that pretty much wraps it up for this video today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!